I'm Rabbi Jeff Middleman, founding director of Sinai and Synapses. Several weeks ago, our Sinai and Synapses Fellows came together for a meeting to be able to explore questions surrounding God's creation and our creation. That day, two of our fellows, Stephanie Leacock and Tom Wasink, had a fascinating conversation about the theological and philosophical and ethical questions that arise from our ability to manipulate genetic code. Stephanie is a professor of genetics and is also married to an Episcopal priest. Tom is a professor of psychiatry and is also a pastor. So enjoy this conversation between the two of them as they explore the religious implications of God's creation and our creation.
One of my major transformative realizations was in my Bio 2 class in college when we learned about DNA polymerase and the role that it has in faithfully copying DNA. But it also has a very, very low error rate. So that struck me in two ways. One is that it's amazing that a protein that's that important and central to every cell can perform something so faithfully. Like imagine myself trying to copy 1 billion base pairs and only making 10 errors, right? It just is a natural level of success.
Yeah.
Also that very, very small mutation rate is actually one of the sources of value, right? That we get something, we being cellular life, get something from that small mutation rate because we're able to produce variation.
Yeah, I remember that too. I remember learning about DNA replication and then the error checking and just how complicated and elaborate the error checking machinery is.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing somebody had made an animation of what replication looked like, and when you learn it in a textbook, it's, you learn, well, you add this base pair and then this base pair and this base pair, and then that's translated to an amino acid and that's added on, and it sounds like it'd take an hour, to add 3 amino acids.
Yeah.
But it was like a jet engine. The pace with which the stuff was moving through, it was amazing. It was incredible.
Exactly. So for me, it was that realization of how this is happening in every cell that divides all the time. And that it didn't make sense with the idea of God's involvement in the world. Like that genome variation, I don't think is a result of God pointing to a single DNA polymerase and saying, change that one right now. It seems too earthly an activity for God to control. And the fact that it's happening in every cell, from bacteria to humans and plants and fungus.
Well, it sounds like a part of what got your attention was the randomness of it. Like that as a mechanism, it doesn't make sense that God would be involved in each decision that's being made by the DNA polymerase and by the repair machinery. Right? I mean, is that a part of what sort of struck you?
Absolutely. And I can tell you that from teaching genetics, getting students to grasp the randomness of mutation is one of the difficult concepts. Like, because they've been taught that that natural selection like favors certain things, right? They almost feel like the cell engineered its own mutation, right? The cell mutated to do this.
Yeah.
When actually it's the opposite. The cell could do this because of the mutation, and that was valuable.
Yeah.
But the mutation itself was random.
Yeah. And so then how did it sounded like that connected with just ideas of God and his involvement in things for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that would have been, gosh, that's going on like almost 20 years ago, probably now. And so it hasn't really come full circle to me until I started teaching genetics, and specifically teaching ideas about current methods of genome modification, right? Now that we have the ability to make a targeted mutation in a And then most of the time when I ask students about pros and cons, would you do this, would you not? They most often will say, no, we shouldn't do it because it's playing God.
Uh-huh.
So as I started to roll that around in my head, that I don't think God controls mutation, because I can't accept that, oh, if someone gets a mutation that causes them to get cancer, God, I don't think, was in that mutating event, right? So I can't reconcile why we think that manipulating genomes is a feature of God in the world.
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating, because I think that people who I've interacted too with people from a faith background have this notion that God is intimately involved in everything.
Yes.
Like that there is this notion of God being in control of all the little details. But then I agree, you try to imagine that specific mechanism of DNA replication that includes a certain error rate, a certain number of those errors are repaired. The basic principle is that it's random, that it's chance.
Right.
And so to think about, well, how is God involved in that? It probably isn't like that God is making one-by-one decisions on which mutations happen and which get fixed.
Right.
You know, so yeah. So what do you say to the students, or what do they say?
I don't know, and that's sort of what I'm trying to get at, is how I flesh out this idea to people who maybe don't have the same level of understanding of genetics as we might have. Like, how do we convey that and ask them to think more about, like you say, if you default to this playing God argument, you ignore a lot of other legitimate questions, right?
Right.
I think that's
what's good. I think that's
some cases in which CRISPR is okay, right? I mean, if we're just talking about like only life-saving technologies, well then maybe giving someone antibiotics is playing God, right?
Yeah.
If you think like that we can't intervene in human health is one argument, but what other questions can I get them to look at that would be more helpful in thinking about why they might be for or against the CRISPR technology?
Well, and it reflects a very specific notion of God and his role in the world. I think that's probably where my thinking has evolved or has changed, because I grew up with a more traditional Christian understanding of the involvement of God, and this notion of playing God was a term that was used. I'm not even quite sure at this point in my life what exactly it means and how certain domains of things came to be playing God. It seems to me, so I taught a class with undergrads, freshmen here at Iowa, and we asked some of these questions, these intersection of religion and science questions, and focused on genetics, taught a class on CRISPR technology. And it was really interesting to me just to think about, if my experience was that if we talk about playing God and what is God's domain, that it actually diverts attention for us from asking the real questions, from asking the ethical questions. Why should we as human beings be doing this? What would we as a human society value? And that if the focus becomes, well, it's playing God, it seems like it just diverts attention from that. Like it's this vacuum that takes attention away, and we start to wrestle with, well, they're interesting questions. What's God's role? What's my role?
Right.
But I ended up feeling like it was sort of, it was like a way out, or a way of avoiding. What do we actually think about these things? And I think I just have a different, I think that my notion of God at this point is he sort of says, have at it.
Well, and then I wonder if you flip the question around on someone and said like, well, another thing that God does, God forgives. So is that playing God? Like, to forgive, if we think about some of the positive attributes and actions that we know God does, no one complains that those events are playing God. Right? What is it? How is it that we want to be godly? And what are we willing to accept?
I think it's good. I think a lot. I'm more similar to that. I think God God informs, and God brings us into a system of values and a way of understanding ourselves as human beings and what's important. And he then says to us, given that, what do you think you should do? You know, how do you think you should engage with this technology? And I kind of think too that nobody has ever actually put the brakes on technology. One of the things about CRISPR technology that's really interesting is that even the scientists are kind of freaked out by it, you know, by what you can do with technology. And so they're saying we need to address the ethical, moral questions before we race ahead with this.
Right. But I would tell this to my students also. I think we also, in the students that we teach, are probably also very US centric, right? To tell them, like, even if it's not allowed in this country, someone will do this in another country. Like, there are plenty of places that have less involvement, less regulation. And so, you know, your politicians and leaders can take all kinds of stances, but it won't, the world that we live in is connected and it will happen.
Right.
So I mean, I fully believe that.
No, I think so too. And I've mentioned this before, but one of the most interesting moments for me with the students I was working with was we talked about CRISPR and the different, just kind of clear-cut health benefits that it could provide, alleviating, for sure, single gene diseases.
Absolutely.
And then, you know, the questions about, well, do you want to do germline modifications? So you're not just treating the person, but removing that as a possibility from future generations from that person. But then the big question that people go to straight away is just sort of beneficial modifications. I'm going to make myself smarter. I'm going to make myself whatever the cult. And this is where it gets complicated, is that culture determines a lot.
That's right.
Culture is going to determine who has access, because it's going to be a part of it. But also, what are the culturally approved of or appealing traits? Like height, physical ability, skin color, all sorts of things like that. And then it becomes kind of comparative competitive. So when I asked the students, this other co-teacher and I, when we asked the students, do you wish your parents had genetically modified you? They all said no, because they wanted to be themselves. They wanted sort of their own identity, and they didn't want to have to live up to the expectation of being a genetically modified person. Because what that means is somebody else now has an expectation of you, like they've invested in your genetic engineering. And so, but when we asked, but what about your children? Would you want to genetically engineer your children? Almost all of them said yes. And I think it's because they were aware of the competition. They sort of felt helpless in the face of what you're describing. Somebody is going to do this, and I don't want my children to be disadvantaged, so I'm kind of going to have to. You know, it was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
You know, and that was independent of any notions of God or spirituality or how that get involved with it. So
that's a hard question for what you had freshmen, so they were probably 18 to 19 years old, to really grapple with. I wonder, you know, within, you know, the next decades, if not sooner, probably all those students who come to college will know their genome sequence, right? Will have had it done at some point in their life. And then I wonder if that question of, do you wish your parents had modified you, would be different if they knew specific things about their genome that did. You know what I mean? Like,
totally, yeah.
Because I think now we're answering that question from the sort of default ignorance about our own genomes and what they predispose us to.
Yeah.
But if they sort of knew some of their predispositions, I wonder if they will have a different take on that.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating to think about, because if we know our genomes and there are variants that we could easily modify to make ourselves better, more capable, would we have wished that would have happened to us? I don't know. I kind of like to think not. I don't know where it's going to go, but just the press of competition and of comparativeness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So you're thinking about teaching this stuff in your church, right?
Yeah, I am. I kind of just feeling like my understanding of genetics is maybe a gift that I have and should utilize. And so I want to sort of teach this over a couple weeks as just a pilot to get an idea of what's the current level of understanding and maybe level of anxiety that's out there, and sort of see what questions I can unearth and maybe either help answer, or even if we don't answer, just grapple in a community of faith.
And so have you looked into it? Like, is your church open to it? Does it seem like?
Well, they gave me permission to talk about it, so we'll see what happens. We'll see if they like it.
That'd be cool. Yeah, I did it. So I'm the pastor at my church, or a pastor, so I don't need anybody's permission.
Yeah.
But I taught a class, and there were just like 8 or 10 people who came, and it was really interesting. Like they're super interested in the topic. We taught Your Inner Fish. Mm-hmm. It was a great book.
Yeah.
But I think, most of them, including myself, had pretty traditional. The origin stories from the Bible are really important to us. Mm-hmm. And I think most of the people in the class didn't realize how important until we actually engaged with genetics and evolution and the story that it tells about who we are and how we've come to be. I think it was a really good experience, but it was unsettling for a lot of the people in the class. Yeah. I think it's funny how we kind of live with surface knowledge of these things that we pick up through our various settings, but rarely look at it in depth. Just how different the stories are about who we are and how we've come to be, and the different meaning that it makes of life and existence.
Right. What does it mean for you if the creation story is not true? How does that change the way that you wake up and face the world?
Right. And if it's not telling me what I thought it was about me, what is it telling me? Mm-hmm. Is there still something that comes to me from that story that's helpful?
Right. Yeah.
The way I understand my life and how I'm supposed to live and what it's all about.
Yeah.